Story 1. When my daughter Olivia was 6, she developed an imaginary friend. It wasn't unusual. Plenty of kids her age had them. But something about the way she spoke about this friend unsettled me. His name is Mr. Cinder, she told me one evening at dinner, her little legs swinging under the chair. He likes to sit under my bed. I exchanged a glance with my husband. Mark, under your bed? I asked lightly. That doesn't sound very comfortable. Olivia shrugged and took another bite of her mashed potatoes. He doesn't mind. He said he likes the dark. I let it go. Kids say weird things. But over the following weeks, Olivia talked about Mr. Cinder more and more. She claimed he whispered stories to her at night, and that sometimes he made jokes that made her laugh so hard she had to bury her face in her pillow so we wouldn't hear. Mark found it amusing. She's just imaginative, he assured me. We should be glad she's creative. And for a while, I convinced myself that was true, until Olivia's behavior started changing. At first, it was small things. She didn't want to go to bed with the lights on anymore, only in total darkness. She started shushing me if I walked into her room too quickly, claiming I might wake Mr. Cinder. But the worst part was her new way of playing hide and seek. She didn't run or giggle like before. Instead, she would find a dark corner, under the table, in the hall closet, beneath the stairs, and crouch there, waiting silently, sometimes for hours if we didn't find her. One night, I woke up to the sound of giggling. The baby monitor on my nightstand glowed softly. It was Olivia. I grabbed the monitor and listened. She wasn't just laughing. She was whispering. I felt an icy knot form in my stomach. My daughter was having a conversation with someone. Slipping out of bed, I padded quietly down the hall and peeked into her room. She was sitting up in bed, her blanket pulled to her chin. But what chilled me was the way her head was slightly tilted downward, as if listening to someone speaking from the floor. "Shoo," she giggled. "I won't tell." I flicked on the light. Olivia gasped, startled, and turned to me with wide eyes. "Mommy," she scolded, "you scared Mr. Cinder away." I did my best to laugh it off. "Sweetheart, I think it's time we stop playing with Mr. Cinder. He's just pretend, after all." Her face darkened. He doesn't like when people say that. That night, I barely slept. Things escalated quickly after that. Olivia started sleepwalking, and every time I found her, she was always in the same place, standing just outside my bedroom door, her tiny fingers grazing the wood. She never spoke, never moved until I led her back to bed. One night, Mark found her in the living room, staring at the empty fireplace. "I was talking to Mr. Cinder," she murmured. Mark sat her down the next morning, gently telling her that Mr. Cinder wasn't real and that she needed to stop pretending. Olivia's little face crumpled. She burst into tears, but it wasn't a tantrum. It was something else. "He's going to be so mad," she sobbed. That night, I made sure to tuck her in tightly, leaving her nightlight on. I was exhausted, my nerves frayed, but something woke me up again. This time, it wasn't laughter. It was whispering, but it wasn't Olivia's voice. I bolted upright. The sound was soft, low, curling in the silence of the night. It came from the baby monitor. I snatched it up, listening. The whispering was rhythmic, deliberate. I couldn't understand the words, but the tone was unmistakable. Someone was speaking to my daughter. My body moved before my mind caught up. I ran down the hall, through open Olivia's door. She was gone. The bed was empty, the covers pushed aside. Panic surged through me. I turned, my breath coming in short gasps. Then I saw her. She was standing in the corner of the room, facing the wall. And she was not alone. A shadow crouched beside her, long and spindly, its head tilted toward her ear. It didn't move when I entered. It only whispered. I felt my stomach twist violently, but I forced myself forward, grabbing Olivia's arm and yanking her away. She cried out, struggling against me. "No," she shrieked. "He's my friend. He said he'd take me where it's warm." I didn't stop. I ran from the room, from that thing, clutching my daughter as she kicked and screamed in my arms. I locked us in the bathroom, trembling. Olivia sobbed against me, her little body shaking, and then she whispered something that made my blood freeze. "He says he'll wait. He always waits." We moved out of that house 2 weeks later. Olivia never spoke about Mr. Cinder again, but sometimes, late at night, I catch her looking into dark corners, as if expecting to see something waiting there. And sometimes, just for a moment, I swear I see it too. Story 2. When my brother and I were kids, we spent every summer at our grandfather's cabin deep in the woods of northern Maine. It was a tradition, one that started before we were even born. Our father had spent his summers there too, and so had his father before him. The cabin was old but sturdy, a relic from a time when people built things to last. It sat beside a crystal-clear lake, the kind that seemed almost black when the sun wasn't hitting it just right. There was no internet, no television, barely even cell service. Just us, the trees, and the water. I used to love it, until the summer when everything changed. That was the year my grandfather passed away, leaving the cabin to my dad. We hadn't been back since the funeral, and when we finally returned, the place felt different. Not in a way I could explain, but in a way I could feel. There was something wrong with the air. It was too still, too thick, like the trees were listening, like the lake was watching. The first few days were normal enough. My dad busied himself with repairs. My brother Jonah and I spent our time swimming and skipping rocks, trying to shake off the eerie feeling that clung to the place. But then the whispers started. The first time I heard them, I was alone on the dock, my feet dangling in the water. It was late afternoon, the sun stretching long golden fingers across the rippling surface. And then, from somewhere just beneath me, I heard it. A voice. Soft, distant, just on the edge of understanding. I jerked back, my breath catching. I thought maybe I had imagined it, that it was just the wind carrying distant sounds. But when I looked at Jonah, he was staring at the water too, his face pale. "You heard that?" I whispered. He nodded. We told my dad, but he just laughed. "It's the lake," he said. "Water carries sound in weird ways." I wanted to believe him. I really did. But then Jonah went missing. It happened in the middle of the night. I woke up to the creak of the cabin door swinging open. At first, I thought it was Dad going outside to check something. He was always paranoid about the generator. But then I noticed Jonah's bed was empty. I sat up, my skin prickling with cold. "Jonah?" I whispered. No answer. The door swayed slightly, moving with the wind. And then, from outside, I heard it. A voice. A whisper. I ran to the door, heart pounding, and stepped onto the porch. Jonah was walking toward the lake, barefoot, dressed in his pajamas, moving with slow, dreamlike steps. His arms hung at his sides, his head tilted slightly forward. "Jonah!" I called. He didn't stop. I ran after him, my feet slapping against the damp earth. He was almost to the water now, the dark waves licking at the shore. I grabbed his arm, pulling him back. His skin was ice cold. "Jonah!" I shook him, panic rising in my chest. He blinked, his face slack and confused. "What?" His voice was hoarse, like he had been whispering for hours. "You were sleepwalking," I said, my heart still hammering. "You were going into the lake?" His eyes widened, fear creeping into his expression. I thought I was dreaming," he whispered. "I heard. I thought Grandpa was calling me." A chill ran down my spine. We didn't go back to sleep that night. The next morning, Dad found us sitting on the porch, pale and shaken. We told him everything, about the whispers, about Jonah's sleepwalking. His face darkened. "There's something I never told you," he said. "Something my father told me when I was your age." He took a deep breath, staring out at the water. "This lake isn't just any lake," he said. "It's old. Older than this cabin. Older than our family. And it doesn't like to be alone." He looked at Jonah. "You're not the first to hear it," he said quietly. "I heard it too when I was a boy." I shivered. "What does it want?" Dad exhaled slowly. "Company. That was our last summer at the cabin. Dad sold it the following year, and we never went back. But sometimes, when I'm lying in bed late at night, just on the edge of sleep, I hear it again. A whisper, calling my name. Story 3. When my husband and I moved into our new house, we thought we had found our forever home. It was a beautiful Victorian-style house in a quiet neighborhood, the kind of place that had history, charm, and, most importantly, plenty of space for our daughter, Lily, to grow up. The house had been vacant for years before we bought it, but the previous owner had kept it in surprisingly good shape. There was something warm about it, something inviting, like it had been waiting for a family to return. For the first few weeks, everything was perfect. We spent our weekends unpacking, painting, and making the place our own. Lily, who had just turned 5, loved exploring the nooks and crannies, particularly the attic, which had a little round window that overlooked the backyard. Then she met the girl in the closet. It started with small things. Lily would pause in the hallway, staring at the closed door of the linen closet as if she heard something inside. She'd hum little songs I'd never taught her, strange melodies that made my skin prickle. Then one evening, as I tucked her into bed, she smiled up at me and said, "She likes it when you sing to me, Mommy." I frowned. "Who does, sweetheart?" "The girl in the closet." A chill ran down my spine. At first, I brushed it off as childhood imagination. Maybe Lily was lonely in the new house, and her mind had conjured up an imaginary friend. But then the noises started. Late at night, when the house was still, I would hear soft shuffling from the hallway. Footsteps too light to be my husband's, too soft to belong to our dog. The first time I heard them, I got out of bed and crept to the doorway, peering out into the darkened hall. The linen closet door was open, just a crack. I was sure I had closed it before bed. Heart hammering, I stepped closer and reached for the knob, pulling the door open. Nothing, just neatly folded towels, extra blankets, and the faint scent of old wood. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling that something had been there just moments before. A week later, Lily woke up crying in the middle of the night. When I rushed into her room, she was curled into a ball, sobbing into her pillow. I smoothed her hair, whispering soothing words, trying to calm her. "What's wrong, baby?" "She's mad," Lily whimpered. "She said you don't believe in her." I felt my stomach drop. "Who, sweetheart?" "The girl in the closet," she sniffled. "She doesn't like when you pretend she's not real." A heavy silence filled the room. I forced a smile. "It's just a dream, love." Lily shook her head. "No, she was in here. She touched my hair." I tried to dismiss it, to tell myself it was just childhood imagination, but I started keeping the hallway light on at night. Then the drawings started. I found them one afternoon while tidying up Lily's room. Dozens of crayon sketches on scrap paper, tucked beneath her bed. They were all the same. A little girl with dark, hollow eyes standing in a doorway. I confronted Lily, trying to keep my voice light. "Did you draw these, honey?" She nodded, her expression unreadable. "Who is she?" Lily looked at me like I was being silly. "I told you," she said simply. "She lives in the closet." I showed the drawings to my husband that night. He laughed nervously, brushing it off as typical kid behavior, but I could see the unease in his eyes. That night, I dreamed of whispers, soft, unintelligible, curling around me in the darkness. When I woke up, the air was thick, suffocating, and the closet door was open. I finally had enough. The next morning, I called the real estate agent, asking about the house's history. She hesitated. "Well, it's an old house," she said carefully. "Lots of history. But there was an incident." I gripped the phone tighter. "What kind of incident?" "A little girl. She went missing, a long time ago. The police searched, but they never found her." I felt cold all over. "Where did she live?" I whispered. A pause. "Your house." I hung up without another word. That night, I slept with Lily in our bed, keeping her close. At some point, I woke to the feeling of fingers brushing my hair, a soft tug, like a child's hand. I held my breath, frozen. Then, just as suddenly as it came, the touch was gone. The next day, we packed our things and left. I don't know what happened in that house all those years ago, and I don't want to know. But sometimes, when I close my eyes, I still hear it. The soft creak of a door slowly swinging open, and the whisper of a little girl, waiting. Story 4. We bought the farmhouse on impulse. It was too perfect to pass up. An old but well-maintained property, miles away from the noise of the city, surrounded by rolling fields and dense, whispering woods. My husband, Adam, was the one who fell in love with it first. "Think of all the space for Ben," he had said. ruffling our son's hair. At 6 years old, Ben had grown tired of our cramped apartment, always dreaming of tree houses, animals, and wide open spaces. This place feels peaceful, Adam had said, and for a while it was. Until the scarecrow moved. The scarecrow stood at the edge of the cornfield, tall and spindly, its burlap sack face stitched into a crude smile. The previous owners had left it behind, and I didn't think much of it at first. It was just a decoration, an old farm relic, meant to keep the crows at bay. Ben, however, was fascinated by it. "I think he's lonely," he said one evening as we sat on the porch, watching the sun dip below the horizon. "I see him moving sometimes." I smiled. "It's just the wind, sweetheart." He shook his head. "No, he waves at me." A cold breeze stirred the fields, and I glanced at the scarecrow. It stood motionless, its stitched grin wide and frozen. I forced a chuckle. "Well, if he waves again, make sure to wave back." That night, I dreamed of rustling corn and the soft creak of wood bending under unseen weight. A few days later, I caught Ben sitting in the backyard, whispering to himself. "What are you up to, buddy?" I asked, ruffling his hair. He pointed toward the scarecrow. I was telling him about school. A strange unease settled in my stomach. I looked toward the field, squinting against the sun. The scarecrow stood exactly where it had always been, tall, still, lifeless. But something felt off. "Sweetheart, the scarecrow isn't real," I said gently. "It's just stuffed with straw." Ben frowned. "I know that," he said, as if I were the silly one. "But he still listens." That night, I locked all the doors and closed the blinds, feeling ridiculous. The next morning, the scarecrow was closer. Not by much, maybe 10 feet farther into the field, but I noticed it immediately. I stood at the back door, gripping my coffee mug, heart hammering. "Adam," I called, "did you move the scarecrow?" He looked up from his newspaper, raising an eyebrow. "What? No. Why would I?" I said nothing, just turned back toward the window, watching the thing in the field. Its stitched grin seemed wider now, its head tilted just slightly, like it was listening. I shook off the unease. Maybe it had fallen over and Adam had propped it back up without thinking. That had to be it. That night, Ben woke up screaming. Adam and I bolted from bed, running to his room. He was sitting up, shaking, his small hands gripping his blanket. "What is it, sweetheart?" I asked, brushing the damp curls from his forehead. He pointed at the window. "He was there," he whispered. My stomach dropped. "Who?" Ben's lip trembled. "The scarecrow." The next morning, I went outside. I stood at the edge of the field, staring at it. It hadn't moved again, but now that I was closer, I could see that something was wrong. The burlap face looked different. The stitching seemed fresh, the crude smile pulled tighter. The wooden post it had been tied to looked warped, as if something heavy had been pressing against it. A crow landed nearby, its black eyes sharp and watchful. I swallowed hard and turned back toward the house. I didn't tell Adam. That night, I heard footsteps outside. Soft, dragging, slow. I gripped Adam's arm. "Do you hear that?" He groaned, half asleep. "It's the wind, babe." But I knew better. I got up, my breath shallow. I tiptoed to the window and carefully pulled back the curtain. The yard was empty, but the scarecrow, it was closer, right at the edge of the field. I barely slept. By morning, it was back in its original spot, but I knew what I had seen. Adam finally believed me when he saw the footprints. They weren't ours. Long, narrow, dragging footprints leading from the field to the house, circling the perimeter. "Jesus," Adam whispered, his face pale. "Who the hell would do this?" I didn't have an answer. That night, I locked every door and window. I sat in bed, holding Ben close, listening. The rustling came around midnight. Soft, rhythmic, like something dragging through the grass. Then, tap, tap, tap. My breath hitched. It was coming from the window. Ben whimpered, burying his face in my chest. The tapping came again, more insistent. I squeezed my eyes shut, my heart pounding. I didn't want to look, but I had to. Slowly, I turned my head toward the window, and I saw it. The scarecrow, standing on the porch, grinning, its head tilted, watching, waiting. I didn't scream. I couldn't. I just grabbed Ben and ran. We left that night. Didn't pack. Didn't look back. When we called the police, they found nothing. No footprints. No sign that anyone had been there. The scarecrow was back in its spot, standing motionless in the field, its stitched smile wide and knowing. We never went back, but sometimes, in the dead of night, I still hear the tapping, and I wonder, did we really leave it behind? Story 5. It started with the knocking. At first, I thought it was just the house settling. Old houses make noise, and ours was no exception. We had only lived here a few months, still getting used to its quirks. The way the pipes groaned in the winter, how the floorboards creaked even when no one was walking on them. But this was different. The knocking always came at the same time. 3:12 a.m. 3 soft taps, then silence. The first few nights, I ignored it. It wasn't until my son, Max, mentioned it that I started to worry. "Mommy, someone keeps waking me up," he said one morning over breakfast. I nearly dropped my coffee. "What do you mean, sweetheart?" Max frowned, his little hands gripping his spoon. "I hear knocking," he said, "on my wall." A cold shiver ran down my spine. "Maybe it's just the wind," I said carefully. Max shook his head. "It's not the wind. The wind doesn't knock 3 times. I forced a smile. "Maybe you're dreaming it." He gave me a look, one far too serious for a 6-year-old. "Then why do I wake up at the same time every night?" I started staying up. I would sit in bed, eyes glued to the clock, waiting. 3:11 a.m. I held my breath. 3:12 a.m. Tap, tap, tap. The sound was soft, deliberate, coming from the wall that separated Max's room from the hallway. I jumped out of bed, heart hammering, and rushed into the hall. The moment I turned the corner, silence. I found Max sitting up in bed, wide-eyed, blankets pulled to his chin. "You heard it," he whispered. I nodded. I didn't sleep that night. I told my husband, Eric, the next morning. He chuckled, rubbing a hand over his face. "It's an old house, babe. Maybe the wood is shifting." I glared at him. Shifting? At exactly the same time every night? He shrugged. "Maybe we have mice?" I wanted to believe him. I really did. But that night, I made a decision. I knocked back. At 3:12 a.m., I sat on the edge of my bed, pulse racing. Tap, tap, tap. I swallowed hard, raised my hand, and knocked 3 times. The silence stretched. My skin prickled. Then, from the other side of the wall, tap, tap, tap. I felt my breath catch. I ran to Max's room. He was sitting up, trembling. "Mommy!" I grabbed him, pulling him into my arms. "It's okay, sweetheart," I whispered. But it wasn't, because the knocking didn't stop. It got louder, faster, from inside the wall. Eric finally believed me when he heard it himself. We called a contractor the next day to check for animals in the walls. He cut into the drywall, pulling away the old wooden panels. And then he went pale. "Jesus Christ," he muttered. Buried inside the wall was a door, a small, wooden door, nailed shut. Eric and I stared at it, speechless. "What the hell is that?" I whispered. The contractor ran a hand over his mouth. I don't know." "Open it," Eric said. The contractor hesitated. "Ma'am, sir, I really don't think." "Open it," I repeated. He sighed and pried the nails loose. The old wood groaned, dust spilling into the air. The door creaked open, and the smell hit us. Rot, damp, something old and foul. Inside, there was a small, dark space, no bigger than a crawl space. And in the middle of it, a chair, an old wooden chair. And in that chair, a bundle of fabric, carefully folded. No, not fabric. A dress. A child's dress. Max clung to my leg, his voice small. "Mommy." I turned to him, my heart pounding. "I don't like this house anymore." Neither did I. We moved out 2 weeks later. The knocking never followed us. But sometimes, late at night, I wake up anyway, at exactly 3:12 a.m. And I swear, somewhere, just beyond the walls, something knocks.